Hitler's dark ambitions, his dreams and fantasies of Germanic world domination lie shattered amid the ruins of Berlin. The destruction of the perverted science of Nazism has involved the laying waste of the great cities of Europe and the loss of millions of lives. The spring of 1945 has seen Soviet armies rampage mercilessly through eastern Germany, enacting an orgy of sadistic revenge upon the people of the Third Reich. In the skies of Germany, the true strength of air power has been proven as American flying fortresses and British Lancasters fly unopposed and unchallenged to systematically rain destruction, city by city. As Allied armies penetrated ever deeper into the heartland of Nazism, the secret horror of Hitler's state was exposed to the world as the invaders encountered the camps and the victims of the final solution. The armies on all sides fighting in those last desperate days were aware that their leaders no longer fought for victory, no longer looked to the end of the war, but were contemplating the beginning of the peace. Stalin already regarded Britain and America with suspicion, seeing a deep conspiracy between his Western allies and their soon-to-be defeated enemy to confound and destroy Soviet communism. Already, the leaders of Britain and America did fear an expansionist Soviet Union that would seek to replace Nazism with another totalitarian dictatorship across a European empire. In the eye of the storm of flame and smoke that had engulfed his capital, Hitler had died by his own hand. Italian dictator Mussolini was executed, his body set to hang in public humiliation. As the people of America and Britain rejoiced in the streets, celebrating victory in Europe, already the battlegrounds of Europe were being prepared for a new confrontation. On the other side of the world, men still fought. There was still suffering. There was still World War. The great party that was VE Day was May 8, 1945. The surrender terms agreed that all German forces on all fronts were to unconditionally lay down their weapons and cease fire on the 8th. Yet fighting in Europe continued for days after. Isolated pockets of German troops fought on. Far behind the front line of fighting, deep in occupied France, fortress garrisons of German soldiers left as far behind as the Atlantic coast continued to hold out. These forces were surrounded and isolated and had been bypassed by the Allies as strategically unimportant in the big picture of the war. These troops were to surrender days after the official end of the war. In the East, Stalin did not accept the surrender, and he demanded that a separate peace be made. In fact, Russian soldiers were ordered to carry on fighting even after this Eastern truce. They pushed deep into Czechoslovakia, aiming to extend the area of territory that would fall under communist domination. It was 3 days after the supposed surrender that the Russians ceased fighting. By then, the Soviet forces had liberated the Czech capital city of Prague. Amongst the Nazi soldiers who fought in this last battle were a large contingent of ex-prisoners of war, former Soviet soldiers who had changed sides to fight against Stalinism. Millions of Soviet citizens had seen the Nazis as liberators. The fate of these men in the peace was to be grim: execution for the officers, long incarceration in the Gulag for the ordinary soldier. On VE Day, as Churchill stood with the British King George, acknowledging the adulation of the British people, he perhaps knew that, like Hitler, his time was gone. Churchill had come to power in the direst days of the war, as a man unassociated with the appeasement of the 1930s. Churchill's defiant and stubborn will to resist had been the only weapon in Britain's arsenal for much of 1940. He kept the war alive when it would have been easy to give in to Hitler. Churchill's scheming to somehow bring America into the war had led to the ultimate defeat of Nazi Germany. Churchill wanted the wartime government, a coalition of all British political parties, to continue into the peace. The British Labour Party refused. Churchill was forced to resign, and a general election was called. Despite being cheered wherever he went, Churchill's Conservatives were destroyed in the poll, with the Labour Party winning a massive majority in Parliament. Churchill had been a disastrous peacetime politician and was too close to the policies of the 30s that had brought poverty and mass unemployment. The mood in Britain was that the war had been fought to win a better future, and that the new peacetime world had to be better than the 1930s. Thus it was that in the last days of the war and the coming peace, Britain's Prime Minister was to be Clement Attlee, a small and quiet man, in many ways the exact opposite of all that Churchill was. It was to be Attlee that sat in Britain's chair at the Potsdam Conference, held between July 17th and August 2nd, 1945. Potsdam was to be the last great conference of the leaders of all three great powers. The Potsdam Conference was to shape post-war Europe, draw its borders, determine the type of society in which the peoples of Europe would live. The state of Poland was physically moved westwards into Europe. The USSR took eastern Poland. Poland was compensated by territory taken from eastern Germany. The Potsdam Communique described the move as temporary, pending a final peace conference. It authorized the ethnic cleansing of millions of Germans who were expelled westward. In fact, that final settlement was not to come, and the new map was not accepted by Germany until 1990 and the final withdrawal of Soviet armies. It's often forgotten that even in July 1945, the Soviet Union and the Empire of Japan were actually at peace. It was via Moscow that the Japanese had made requests for peace to America and Britain. Japan wanted a negotiated peace. The Potsdam Conference told Japan there could be no question of an honorable, face-saving peace, that their surrender would have to be unconditional, that the Japanese government would be removed, Japan occupied and stripped of colonies, that Japanese leaders would face trial for war crimes, and, above all, that Japanese society would be forcibly modernized and democratized. An image which came to be seen as an iconic demonstration of the total defeat of Germany was the meeting of Western armies, the troops of Britain and America, with those of Russia coming from the east. The unification of the two arms of Allied attack underlined the totality of Nazi defeat. The camaraderie of the soldiers, often staged for the newsreel cameras, was soon to dissolve and be replaced by mistrust and suspicion. At Potsdam, the decision had been taken that the territory of Germany would be divided into different zones of occupation, each under the control of one of the Allied powers. The Soviet Union came to insist that British and American forces, which had penetrated far to the east of Germany, pulled back, and the Soviet Union pushed its forces and the border of communist domination further west. Germany was divided between America, Britain, the USSR, and France. The German capital, Berlin, although deep in the Soviet zone, was also divided into occupation zones. Berlin was to remain an occupied city until the very last decade of the 20th century, an island of the West, deep in the South.